Alright, what's up guys? New video today. We are doing Elemental Hero Neos. We finally gotten around to it, so I'm going to try to tackle all of the hero archetypes soon. I'm not going to be able to do them all in one video. It's physically impossible. I don't even have enough hard drive space on my computer to make that video. And I'm definitely not doing on an external hard drive. I think that'll take me, I'd probably get a 4-year degree before I could render that video out onto an external hard drive. So we're going to do them all in parts. We're starting off with Neos. This is one of my favorites just because it's a going second deck and I love to go second. So we're going to start with this deck. Also, if you're not subscribed, 87% of you are not subscribed. Hit that subscribe button, join the party, let me know what decks you want to see. I do listen because this was a very, very, very heavily requested deck. A lot of you guys wanted heroes, a lot of you guys wanted Neos. So we are doing that today, but enough of the commercials, let's get started. Right off the bat, we have Elemental Hero Air Neos. This card's actually pretty good. Like, of all of the 2-card Neos cards, it's actually one of the better ones. Simply because he gains attack equal to the life point difference between you and your opponent. If your opponent has higher life points, so it gains the difference. So various cards, generally speaking, you'll take damage throughout the duel, and if you have, like, for example, if your opponent has 8,000 and you have 2,000, this thing comes out at an outlandish amount of attack points. Because, like I said, it gains that 6,000 from the difference, and it becomes 8,500 attack. I mean, it's crazy. The only thing that's currently holding this card back is that everyone's playing Dragoon and everyone is playing Predaplan Verde Anaconda, so everyone's going to start the duel off your opponent's always going to start the duel off with 2,000 less life points, more than likely. So that kind of holds this card back a little bit, but still it's a very, very good option in the deck, and this is certainly one of the... I'd say B tier is like a fair one for it. A tier I'm going to reserve for other things. B tier is like a solid place for this card, because you definitely do use it, and you actually use it rather regularly. But yeah, I think this is a more than fair placement for the card. Next, we've got Instant Neo-Space. So Neos cards are actually kind of complicated to place because there are a few really good cards, and then you've got a bunch of terrible cards. So it's actually kind of difficult to place because I can't put every single card into F tier. It would just look dumb. But if this was in any other archetype, it would probably be an F tier. But because it's in Neos, it's not an F tier. This is probably a D tier card. Basically what it does is it's an equip spell that you put onto your Neos fusion monster, and basically all it does is that they don't have to return back to the extra deck. So all it does is just stop the restriction of the card that they printed with that restriction. That's the only thing that this card does. And then if the monster that this card is equipped to kind of leaves the field, or this card leaves the field, basically you get to special summon it floats into an elemental hero, elemental heroes from hand, deck, or graveyard. So it's like okay-ish. It's not the absolute worst card. I assure you there are worse cards in the Neos archetype than this card, but I personally would steer clear of this card. It's not good enough. You need, this is a going second deck. You can't afford to run garbage like this. You have to actually run good cards like Dark Ruler No More and your actual good Neos cards. You cannot afford to run just stuff like this. This is nonsense. You don't need it. Next is Next. The card, it is an F tier. Next is a terrible idea that they had. Basically, it's like a Metamorphosis is a banned card. This is like Metamorphosis within the Neos archetype, but it gets you a monster that is almost always useless. So all you have to do to use this card is tribute a Neo-Spacian, and then you summon a Neo-Spacian from your extra deck with the same amount of levels as that monster. And unfortunately, the targets for this are completely terrible. I think Konami, halfway through it, actually realized that the targets are entirely just garbage, so they scrapped the entire idea, because the only thing they have is Neo-Spacian Twinkle Moss, Neo-Spacian Marine Dolphin, and then Elemental Hero Marine Neo. So there's only 3 monsters that actually utilize this card. They are all terrible, and we'll get to it. First of all, Twinkle Moss is terrible too. Basically, you have to tribute the Neo-Spacian Twinkle Moss, and then you get this thing out. And all this does is, when Twinkle Moss battles, your opponent draws. When this thing battles, you draw. That is the only difference. You go -1, and you get a monster with like 300 more attack, and instead of your opponent drawing, it's you drawing. That is it. Like, there's almost no difference, and you're just playing this terrible card in it. This is another one, Marine Neos, also F tier. Same thing. This does the exact same thing as the regular Neos, except you look at your opponent's hand, and no matter what, whether you successfully destroy a card your opponent has in their hand or you don't, regardless, you just don't inflict 500 life points to yourself. That is the only difference. And then it has a slight attack boost. Again, just terrible. And then this is the worst offender of it all. This is the Elemental Hero Marine Neos. Basically, you have to have... This is like a 4-card combo. And what you actually get at the end is absolutely terrible. You have to have Next in your hand. You have to have an Aqua Dolphin on the field. And you have to have a way to summon Neos. Which, cannot be any of your other ways because you use that normal summon on the... Used your normal summon on the... Aqua Dolphin, so it has to be some other way. So it's basically like a 3-card combo. Then you go into this thing, and then you fuse the Neos with the Marine Dolphin in order to get this thing. And all this Marine Dolphin does is, instead of having to have a monster that's higher attack than the monster in your opponent's hand, you just discard a random card from your hand. From your opponent's hand. You destroy a random card from your opponent's hand. That is the only difference between this thing that requires 4 cards and Aqua Dolphin. And this thing has 2800 attack, and that is it. That is the only difference between this piece of garbage that takes 4 cards and the regular Aqua. It's absolutely terrible. These next cards are all garbage. I think Konami realized, like, I don't know when, but like almost instantly, maybe a month after they came out, a month after the show, that like this entire idea was absolutely terrible. And that's why you only have 2 monsters and then 1 big fusion. And they didn't even bother to make all of the support with all of these other monsters because it was just a terrible idea. It was a -1, and the attack, and then the effects were always lackluster. So these, the all F tier, all garbage. Next, let's move on from the F tiers. We actually have an S tier here. This is like this bipolar jump. This is a really, really good card. Neos Fusion is absolutely amazing. It lets you fuse from your hand, field, or from your deck, and it basically lets you summon a 2-monster Neos Fusion, ignoring its summoning conditions, so you don't have to like contact fuse from the field. You can just send all of the stuff from the deck, which is awesome. And the reason that's awesome is because you can go into what's his name? Rainbow Neos. I don't know where he is. I'm blind. But basically, you can go into Rainbow Neos, which typically used to be one of the most difficult ones to summon, and for that reason had one of the craziest effects. But you can actually cheat out in Rainbow Neos, and this card is so good that before Dragoon came out, people were actually playing this card and summoning the Rainbow Neos off of it because Rainbow Neos was just that good. So all of those effects are so good already. You can't special summon for the rest of the turn if you activate this card, but that's perfectly fine. See, Red Eyes Fusion is terrible as a standalone card because it stops you from summoning, the entire turn, not just for the rest of the turn. This card stops you summoning from the rest of the turn, so you can special summon 50 times and then activate this card and end on the Rainbow Neos, which is super, super duper good. And then on top of that, this card is already very good, but if your if your Neos monster would be destroyed by a card effect or by battle, you can banish this card from the graveyard. And then on top of that, if it would be returned to the extra deck during the end phase, you can also instead just banish this card from the graveyard. So it just helps a lot of the real big issues with the deck. The fact that all of your big monsters basically have no destruction protection, it helps that. And on top of that, that shuffle away mechanic that is in Neos, it actually gives you a way to play around it, which is really, really good. But this card is easily S tier, one of the best cards released in the archetype. It's so good that it actually made the archetype viable. This is a pretty terrible deck up until some of the new support came out. I forget what set it was. Maybe, I don't know if it was Dark Neostorm. I don't remember the exact set, but this deck was absolutely garbage until some of that new support came out. I mean, it wasn't just bad; it was literally unplayable. But this card is one of the reasons that this deck is significantly better than it was a few years ago. Next, this is Honest Neos. Honestly, Honest Neos is better in the regular Elemental Hero deck than it is in the Neo-Spacian deck, or the Neos deck. Like I said, I think it's better in those decks than it is in this deck. Again, nothing against this card. I actually think it is a very well written card. It's a good card, But B tier is fair. Basically, just you can discard it and then make one of your hero monsters gain 2500 attack. Like I said, I just think this card is better in the regular hero deck because you have a more reasonable way to search it more easily with like stuff like Shadow Mist. In this particular deck, it's okay, but I just don't think it's as good as some of the others. It's not bad because it can help you sometimes swing for game because you do want to kind of quickly OTK your opponent. There's one of two ways to play this deck. You either activate Dark Ruler and then basically like get rid of their board and then OTK them on turn 4, or you can just instantly try to OTK them. And I don't think this card really helps those two strategies, but just as a card itself, it's not a bad card at all. Alright, next is Common Soul. This is another pretty bad card. I don't even know where to put it here or here. It's just not a good card, honestly. All it basically does, this is a very old card. It's one of your only, this used to be one of your only ways to special summon the Neo-Spacians. Basically, you target a monster on either player's side of the field, and then you can special summon a Neo-Spacian from your hand to the field, and then the monster that you targeted gains attack equal to the Neo-Spacian that you special summon. So you can either target a monster on your opponent's side of the field, and then your Neo-Spacian summons actually to your opponent's field, or you can summon it to your field. That whole summoning to your opponent's field is really, really strange. But yeah, like I don't even know what they were thinking with that. Like, why would you in any way want to special summon a Neo-Spacian to your opponent's side of the field? But you can summon it to your field. But again, it's summoning from the hand, and you have to waste this card on it. And then when it leaves the when this card leaves the field, it's returned to the hand, which is also absolutely terrible. Next is Space Gift. This card is actually like it's C tier. Like honestly, this card isn't like I don't regularly use this card, but as a concept, like as a card itself, it's actually not bad. Like theoretically, it's not a bad card. That's what I'm trying to say. Because to be honest with you, for every single Neo-Spacian you have on the field, you get to draw a card. So in theory, that effect is actually not that bad. Because there are situations where you will have 2-3 Neo-Spacians on the field. Like even if you have one Neo-Spacian on the field, this card's an Upstart Goblin. If you have 3, it's a it's a +2, and if you have 2, it's a Pot of Greed. Like it seems good, but honestly, there are just better cards to play, if I'm being 100% honest. The only reason you would play it in your deck is if you just needed to have a very, very tight, like 40 card deck. That's the only reason that I could think of playing this card. But in theory, honestly, it's not a bad card. It's just when you actually play the deck and you try to use this card, you're like, I'd rather have another card in my hand, or I bricked because I had this card and I don't have access to a Neo-Spacian. That's the kind of stuff that happens with this card. Other than that, it's actually like a half decent card, in theory. Next is the Crystallis monsters. I'm actually just going to put these all together so we can just deal with them all at once because they all essentially do the same thing. Let me not be dumb and miss them. Yeah, they all basically, all they do is just special summon. If you have Neo-Space on the field, you contribute them, and then special summon the corresponding Neo-Spacian from your deck. Like I said, they all basically do the same thing. You have to have Neo-Space on the field, and then they all summon, like I said, like for example, this summons Grand Mole. You tribute this if you have Neo-Space, and you get to summon Grand Mole from the deck. Typically, it was very difficult to summon the Neo-Spacians back in the day from your deck, so this is one of the only ways that you had to do it. So you had to play these cards. You don't play them today because they're just too big of, like, they're terrible bricks. Like just playing all of the Crystallis monsters and playing all of the Neo-Spacian monsters and just playing all of these various cards is just not a smart way to play the deck, particularly when you have things like Neo's Fusion that could just send things from the deck and you don't have to play all this nonsense and garbage. But like I said, these cards used to need to be played because they were an easy way to special summon them, because all of the Neo's Fusions are actually contact fusions, so you'd have to fuse from the field. You don't use polymerization, you don't use super poly, you fuse from the field, so you actually have to get the monsters onto the field, and these used to be one of the only somewhat reliable ways to do it. But these cards are all more or less the same thing. They're all D tier. They're not like absolutely reprehensible like these cards, but they are very, very bad. And if you were to place them all into F tier, I wouldn't even count it against you. I honestly wouldn't. Yeah, like I said, these cards are just not good at all. Yeah, not good at all. Alright, the next card is Contact. This card is one of the only cards that is actually worse than the Crystallis monsters. Actually, I'm going to put this in F tier. All this does is you can send the Crystallis monsters that you control to the graveyard, and then you can special summon, basically you can special summon monsters that are in those cards' texts. So, like, let's say you activate this card and you have the Crystallis mole thing. You can send this to the graveyard and then special summon Grand Mole from your deck, and that is absolutely terrible because it's like, why would you want to do that? Like honestly, why would you want to do that when this basically just prevents you from having to have Neo-Space on the field to resolve this card's regular effect. So if you don't have Neo-Space on the field, you can instead activate this card, and then you can send this to the graveyard and then summon it Grand Mole. So, like, you know, you can play Neo-Space, which is searchable with Terraforming and Metaverse and Set Rotation, all these other cards, or you can play this one random card and hope you see it with these cards. I mean, it's just really bad design. It literally just does nothing. It just does the exact same thing that this card would regularly do, but you don't have to have, like I said, it does the exact same thing that the card regularly does, but you just don't have to have Neo-Space on the field. It's really, really bad. Alright, next is Elemental Hero Chaos Neos. This one's a little, I don't even know where to place this. I really don't summon this one much at all. This is probably, I'd say, top of D tier. Basically, this one can't be summoned off of Neos Fusion because you can only summon Neos monsters that are 2 targets to summon to use Neos Fusion. They have to be a 2 Neos fusion material fusion monster. This one can't be summoned off of Neos Fusion. Now, this one is not that these not that great because you need Elemental Hero Neos, Twinkle Moss, and you need the Dark Panther. You need all 3 of those, and all it does is when it's like all the other fusions, it shuffles itself back into the deck, which is, you know, not good. But if it does, this card actually books all of your opponent's monsters face down, or all monsters on the field face down, which that effect's not bad, except for when you think about you are booking all of the monsters during your end phase. So during your opponent's turn, they could just flip everything back face up. So that's like not that good. And then it has the second effect, which is you can flip three coins, and it's basically Barrel Dragon. Flip 3 coins. If you hit 3 heads, you pop all monsters your opponent controls. If you hit 2 heads, then you get to negate your opponent's monsters for the rest of the turn, which is cool. It's like almost like a Dark Ruler No More without any cost outside of having to summon this monstrosity. And then if you hit 1 heads, it actually returns all of your cards back to your hand, which is so bad. It's hard enough to summon this monster. It really didn't need that outrageous restriction, and it's actually kind of sad that all of these cards are still better than that. Next, we've got Twinkle Moss. This is a C tier. This is one of the Neo-Spacians that I've actually been using less and less and less. This is, like I said, this is a going second deck. This card, basically, when it's attacked or attacks, it gets an effect where it can, like, end the battle phase or attack directly and stuff like that. But it's weird because you basically attack or it's attacked, then your opponent draws a card, so you're giving your opponent advantage, and then random things happen based on the card that your opponent draws. So basically, I'm not a huge fan of this card. The only reason you would even play it is if you want to go into the fusions. If you're going into the fusions that require it, that's the only reason that you would play it. Outside of that, this card is pretty bad. And honestly, you can actually get away with Neo stacks without even playing this card anymore. Next is Aqua Dolphin. Aqua Dolphin, out of all of the Neo-Spacian monsters, like the main deck Neo-Spacian monsters, there's 2 of them that are good, and this is actually one of the ones that are actually good. It's so good that actually warrior decks are playing it in order to get rid of hand traps from your opponent. It's actually, like I said, this one's actually one of the better ones. It basically lets you discard a card, and then you can look at your opponent's hand, and if you have a monster with higher attack, you can destroy a card in your opponent's hand than the monster that's, you know, in your opponent's hand. So that effect is actually pretty good because it's very good against hand traps. Like I said, this deck is like a going second deck, so you actually won't be using that effect quite as much as you think. But it's still, on paper, a very, very good effect. It's pretty good against control decks too, because you can pop a lot of cards in your opponent's hand because you will almost always control a monster with more attack than your opponent has anyway. So that effect is halfway decent. And then if you do it unsuccessfully, you inflict life points to yourself. And if you do it successfully, you inflict life points to your opponent. Meaning, if you destroy a monster in their hand, you inflict 500 life points, which in time can actually help you. And I've literally watched a game at a regionals where somebody activated this and then they just kept playing and they actually won in time like that. Now, I'm not telling you to do that because obviously it's a scumbag way to do it, but it is possible to do that exact thing. So that is actually one of the better ones of the Neo-Spacian monsters. Next, we've got this card. It's Reverse of Neos. This card's not, and it's another one that's just D tier, somewhere in the D tier. It's another, it's like a float. It gives you a floating effect basically, but again, it's just like, it's very lackluster. Like, because number one, it was already pretty bad, but this card actually makes it so you have really no reason to play this, because all this does is when a Neos fusion monster gets destroyed, you can activate this, and then you can basically special summon an elemental hero Neos from your hand deck or graveyard, and then you summon it and it gains 1,000 attack, which that would be cool, but this card already gives you protection for that fusion monster, so it won't get destroyed, and you don't have to play, again, junk like this. Actually kind of hard to grade. Again, everything in D tier I wouldn't even really want to play, so it's tough to grade where exactly how bad it is, but I'd say it's somewhere here. It's slightly worse than Neo-Space, because Neo-Space lets you float also, and it gives you like Neo-Space on the field, and your monster doesn't shuffle itself away. So I'd say it's somewhere here, but again, you can just slide these around because they're all kind of like terrible and unusable. Yep. Next is Neo-Space Pathfinder. This card is, again, not like, this card is only as good as Neo-Space. Is basically what this card does is you discard it and you search Neo-Space. Neo-Space is honestly not that great of a card within the deck. Like, it's really not. There's really no reason to play it. You're gonna, like I said, this is a going second deck, so you're gonna OTK your opponent anyway. It doesn't matter if you're shuffling things away into the extra deck. And actually, a lot of the effects that shuffle, where cards shuffle themselves into the extra deck, are actually really broken effects. Like, there are some that let you banish your opponent's board. There are some that let you shuffle your opponent's board away. So you actually, in a lot of cases, want to shuffle away your monster anyway. So this card, and all of these cards that discard themselves in order to search a field spell, are only as good as the field spell that they're searching. And like I said, Neo-Space is really a card that you don't really even need or really want to play. So for that reason, this card is really not that great. It is better than all of these other cards, and it does search. I do like the concept of monster cards that search field spells. Like, as a concept, it's really good because you don't have to play terraformings, or if you do play terraformings at 1 actually. So if you really if they make a card where Neo-Space is really good, this card is definitely going to be very usable, because then you'll have terraforming, 3 Neo-Space, and this card to search it out. But as of right now, Neo-Space is not that great of a card, so you don't have to search it. Next is Elemental Hero Dark Neos. Basically, it's just a Neos and Black Panther, or a Dark Panther. And it's actually compatible with the Neos fusion. It's actually not like the worst. It's underwhelming for sure. But basically, all this card does is you summon this card, and you can target a monster your opponent controls, and then negate its effects. And as long as this card's on the field, its effects are negated. It's a targeting effect that negates. It's basically like an impermanence that comes off of one monster. It's honestly not the best effect. Like, in a really slowed down game state, it's not bad. But like I said, this card's really not. It's not that great. I gotta say, yeah, it's not that great. Just because. Yeah, it's not that great, because typically there's better options. There's like the Air Neos, and then there's the Brave Neos. There's just better options. Rainbow Neos. There's just better options to play than this card. But you do play it just kind of a toolbox, because this extra deck is actually not that tight at all. You play a ton of different cards, so it's not really like a huge deal if you have this, and it's situational, because most of the time, a lot of the cards in this deck actually lock you into exclusively fusions. So it doesn't even matter that you have like lackluster effects in your extra deck. Definitely not. Alright, next is Elemental Hero Divine Neos. This card is definitely F tier. It doesn't work with the deck. That's the issue with this card. it really doesn't work with the deck because most of the time you're contact fusing or you're using Neo-Spacian. Those are the two ways you're doing it. You're not playing like Miracle Fusion or anything that lets you fusion summon out of the graveyard. What you need for this card is 5 different monsters. Basically, you need to use at least one Neos or one Neos monster, Neo-Spacian, and an elemental hero. Like, way too much different stuff that just, it doesn't work with the archetype. It's too much out of the way. And all it is when you do summon it, and like I said, it's 5 monsters. When you summon it, the only effect that it has is you can banish a hero monster from one of those monsters from the graveyard, and then this card gains 500 attack and gains the attack point. Gains 500 attack, and then it gains the effect of that monster, which can in some cases be fairly good, but the requirements for this are just way too terrible. And on top of the requirements being too bad, it just doesn't work with the rest of the deck. And I think that's one of the reasons. It's one of the biggest reasons it is an F tier. Next, we have Miracle Contact. This is actually an S tier card. This is a very, very good card. This is one of your better ways to summon the Neos monsters, just because it's actually fairly difficult to summon them if you don't cheat them out with some other cards. Basically, this lets you shuffle cards into your deck from your hand, field, or most importantly, the graveyard, and then you can special summon a Neos fusion monster from your extra deck, ignoring summoning conditions. So instead of having to contact fuse with all of these terrible, terrible monsters, you can actually just shuffle them back from the graveyard. You can send, for example, off of Neos Fusion, and then the following turn do a recovery play where you can use this card to summon something back out. That kind of play is very good. Also, your draw spell actually puts Neos monsters into the graveyard very, very easily, so you can actually fill up your graveyard, kind of easily with that or the Neo-Space connector. So for that reason, you actually do put quite a few monsters into the graveyard, and this card works very, very much in that regard. Yeah, just as an extender recovery play, this card is very, very good because it lets you cheat out a lot of the bigger monsters very easily because you can use the graveyard. Alright, next we've got Elemental Hero Nebula Neos. This one is definitely A tier. It's one of the better ones. Yeah, it's tough to say where to put it. It's definitely A tier. It's very, very good. Like, this is one of your main ones that you actually do use. One of your main fusions that you actually do want to go into. Actually, I'll put it above the Aqua Dolphin. So basically, it requires Neo-Spacian Grand Mole, it requires Neos, and it requires Dark Panther. And what it basically does is when it hits the field, you can draw cards equal to the amount of cards that your opponent controls, which is very good. This is a going second deck. It works in context with everything else. So it lets you draw things, and then you get to negate one face-up card on your opponent's side of the field. And then on top of that, during the end phase, if this card's shuffled back, you can banish all other cards on the field face down. So really, really good card because on summon it gives you a ton of advantage because it lets you draw, and then it lets you negate a card, which is really good because you can negate stuff like Borreload Savage Dragon. Borreload Savage Dragon doesn't negate. It doesn't destroy. It negates, but it doesn't destroy. So even if they negate that effect, it's fine because you basically get to bait out and negate. On top of all of that, during the end phase, it banishes everything. This card is extremely good with Dark Ruler No More. Like, very, very good. Like, if you activate Dark Ruler No More and then you successfully summon this monster, you basically have won the duel. Because you stop your opponent from activating any other monster effects, you get to summon, draw a ton of cards. The negating in the middle part doesn't really matter, but during end phase, you banish everything they control. And that is and it's all face down too. It's banished face down, so you basically have no access to that unless they can summon like a Psy-Frame Lord Omega, which is unlikely, but very good card. One of your main boss monsters. There aren't a lot of Neos Fusion monsters that you actually go into, but this is one of the ones that you actually do go into. Alright, next is Contact Gate. This is a good card. I typically play it as a 1-of, though, I'll be honest with you. I'll put this at the top of B tier. This card is actually pretty decent. Like I said, it's more of like a recovery card once you have some decent setup. So basically what this card lets you do is banish 2 Neo-Spacian monsters, and then you can special summon 2 Neo-Spacian monsters from your hand or deck that are different from the 2 that you banished. So it does help you put monsters on board, which is very important for the deck. But then again, you really don't want to be banishing stuff out of your graveyard, and that's where it's more of like a last ditch play. And then you can summon 2 monsters from your, like I said, 2 Neo-Spacians from your deck that are different from the ones that you banished, and then you're locked into fusions for the rest of the turn, which is totally fine. Literally the only monster that you go into that's not a fusion monster in this deck is a Verde Anaconda. Outside of that, you'll just never go into anything else. So you're locked into fusions for the rest of the turn, and then it has a second effect, which is one of your Neos monsters are returned to the extra deck, which they have, most of them have that restriction. You can actually banish the card from the graveyard and then summon one of your banished Neo-Spacian. So it recovers basically the monster that you banished for the activation of this card. So it's halfway decent, I'd say. Neo-Space, I'm going to put this next to right above the Neos Pathfinder. Basically, this gives you 500 attack, and it prevents your monsters from getting banished into during the end phase. Whenever whenever a Neos fusion monster would shuffle itself back into the deck, into the extra deck, and then that whole situation. This card basically just prevents that. It's kind of frustrating that they put that onto the card in the first place. They're going to print a field spell that counteracts the entire restriction. It's kind of pointless. But basically, yeah, they don't shuffle themselves into the extra deck, and you could just use this, and it gives them 500 attack. But to be honest with you, like I've said before, some of these newer effects are actually really good. Like the effects that shuffle themselves into, that activate after you shuffle the monster successfully into the extra deck, have actually become really, really, really good. Like I said, Nebula Neos, when this gets shuffled into the extra deck during the end phase, you get to banish your opponent, the entire board, face down, which is just insane. And again, that would be avoided if you played Neo-Space. And on top of that, you don't really want a field spell that does really kind of nothing. All it does is just let you leave your monsters on board. And if you really want to leave your monsters on board, you could just use Neos Fusion's Graveyard Effect instead. Or you could just use Contact Gate to summon a banished monster. I think that is actually significantly better than using the old Neo-Space. Dark Panther. This one's kind of hard to grade too. This one is one you definitely have to play. I put it right here. It's definitely one that you have to play because you want to go into Nebula Neo, so you do have to have this in your deck. If you do normal summon this monster, this card's actually pretty interesting. It has an effect that you don't see on a lot of cards, and the majority of cards that do have this kind of effect are, in a lot of ways, heavily considered for banlist stuff, or they have been affiliated with FTKs and OTKs and stuff like that. Basically, what it does is it actually lets you copy one of your opponent's monster effects. So this card's on the field, you can target a monster your opponent controls and copy its effects. And you get to copy its effects. And that effect is actually, it can sometimes come in handy. When your opponent has a half-decent effect, it can actually, if they have a monster that negates stuff, you can take this and then give yourself a monster negate. So it's actually it's a somewhat interesting effect, and it does come in handy. Sometimes they'll have a monster that allows you to pop cards. You summon this, activate that. This card's name becomes that card's name, and then you can pop your opponent's cards. The only thing that's annoying is it changes names, so it's no longer a Neo-Spacian, which is a bit of a problem. But outside of that, I'd say it's halfway interesting. And like I said, you have to play this card regardless because you want to go into Nebula Neos. So no matter what, you're going to be playing this anyway. Next is Cocoon Rebirth. This is another one that is just F tier. Basically, this is a continuous spell. All it lets you do is tribute a Crystallis monster and then summon a Neo-Spacian monster that's written on that text. It literally does the exact same thing that the card would regularly do, except you don't have to have Neo-Space on the field. It's like this card and this card are almost the same, but this card is a continuous card that you can activate every turn. That's an ignition effect. Both are absolutely terrible because these cards already do this. If you play Neo-Space, if you're playing these cards, you're already playing Neo-Space, right? That's already bought in. If you're playing this, you're playing Neo-Space. And if you're playing Neo-Space and you're playing this, why would you play this? It's just a worse version of what the card already does. Just small brain. I don't know what to say. Not worth running. All right, next is Neos Force. This card's not great at all. I think it's I don't even know. With these bad cards, it's tough to even place this stuff. I'd say it's right here. Neos Force. It's not the best card. So basically, what it does is it lets you equip it to a Elemental Hero Neos, specifically Elemental Hero Neos. And then if the Elemental Hero Neos gains 800 attack, and it basically becomes an Elemental Hero Flame Wingman, where if it destroys an opponent's monster by battle, you can inflict life points to your opponent equal to the attack of that monster. Now, I personally like Elemental Hero Flame Wingman. I like that effect. I think it's a pretty cool effect for going second, but there isn't really a reason to run this card. On top of this card already not being that great, actually, you know what? These cards are so bad, I'm actually going to place this here. On top of this card really not being that great, during the end phase, it actually shuffles itself back into the deck. So it sort of acts like a lot of these extra deck monsters, where they shuffle themselves into the extra deck at the end phase. This card shuffles itself into the deck during the end phase, and it's just an equip spell that's not broken, and it just gets rid of itself for absolutely no reason. So I don't know why I actually did that. Yeah, that part is this part is probably the worst. It shuffles itself into the extra deck. I almost forgot saying that. But yeah, it's still not as bad as all these other cards down here, but it's still, I don't have a reason why I would want to play it. Alright, next is Elemental Hero Grand Neos. This is one of the ones you definitely play. You go into it occasionally. This is like a B tier. It's somewhere, it's kind of like like Dark Panther. Basically, this is Elemental Hero Grand Neos. All it basically does is it's a 2 material Neos monster. It's just Elemental Hero, Neos, and the Grand Mole. That's all it takes. Basically, what it lets you do is target a monster your opponent controls, bounce it back to the hand. That is it. That's all it does. And then on top of that, end phase, it shuffles itself back. Very, very simple. Not worth playing. Alright, next is Elemental Hero Storm Neos. I actually do like this card. The only thing with this card is you have to play Air Hummingbird, which sometimes you don't even know if you want to play. But it's actually really good. Like, the effects are actually really good. I'd say it's in B tier. Well, actually, you're playing Air Hummingbird anyway, because you're playing the Air Neos. Like I said, I put it here. Just actually no, because if it's slightly more difficult to summon, I put it here. Basically, its effects, like I said, are pretty good. So when this card is summoned, you can destroy, once per turn, you can just destroy all spell and trap cards on the field, which is very, very good. That effect is very, very good. On top of that, when this card is returned to the deck, when this card is returned to the extra deck during the end phase, you can shuffle away all cards on the field, yours and your opponent's, back into the deck. It's like completely non-targeting removal. Very good. This is less good than Nebula Neos, just because it, it shuffles everything away. But if you shuffle everything back to the deck, you actually allow your opponent to kind of like rebuild their board. Because you're putting everything from their extra deck back into their deck. So I would say the Nebula Neos is better, but against certain decks, shuffling things back into their deck is actually the better option. But still, both effects are actually really, really solid. The only issue with this card is that you need to use Air Hummingbird and Aqua Dolphin and Neos in order to summon it. That's the only real issue with it. If it was less complicated to summon, it would be easily higher up. Neos Wise Man. Right now, this card is not that great. Like, as an individual, there's a fusion coming out with this that's not too bad. So I guess you'll have to play one of this in your deck. But as a standalone card, this card is F tier. As a standalone card, it's actually it's hard to place some of this stuff. I honestly, as a standalone card, this card is like one of the worst cards in the whole archetype. So you need to have a Yubel on your side of the field and a Neos, and then you get to send those to the graveyard, summon this card. This card basically has almost no protection. It can't be destroyed by card effects, which sounds good, but let's be honest, everyone's playing Dragoon, so not being destroyed by card effect is irrelevant. On top of that, this card, when it destroys an opponent's monster by battle, inflicts like attack life points equal to that monster's attack. Again, very, very underwhelming. It's just not worth it. Like Dragoon is better in every single way, and most people can out Dragoon, so why would you want to play this? And the summoning requirements of summoning Yubel plus summoning the Neos is way too tough to have to play this card. The only reason, like I said, that you would play this card is if you're running that new fusion. That is the only reason that you would play this card, and you would never actually legitimately summon this card. You would just use it to send to the graveyard with the Neos fusion. That is it. You wouldn't actually use this card. Very difficult to summon, very underwhelming when it hits the field. It actually might be the only card worse than these cards as a standalone card. Next is Wrath of Neos. I actually have like somewhat of a soft spot for this card. I actually don't think it's the worst card. I'd say it's somewhere up here. Basically, you send, if you control a Neos, you can, an Elemental Hero Neos, you can send all other cards on the field to the graveyard. It's not too bad of an effect, I'd say. Especially if you're going second, you can use like a Neo-Space Connector, normal summon a Neos, activate this, send all other cards to the graveyard. It's not too bad. Honestly, like it's really not that bad of a card. It's just there are better cards to do the job, but you know, in concept, it actually isn't too bad. Kind of like Space Gift. It's like okay. It's not the worst card ever. Next is Air Hummingbird. This is a card you have to play. Like, it's not, but I'm going to review it just as its own like standalone effect. This is a card that you have to play. Basically, just gains life points for cards in your opponent's hand. You do have to play it, but that effect is like just okay. But like I said, no matter what, you are going to play this in your deck because you want to go into Air Neos, you want to go into Storm Neos, stuff like that. So you are going to play this card no matter what. But I'd say the effect is, it's just okay. It helps you gain life points. Like if you're going into time, I guess you could use it if you really wanted to. But as a standalone card, it's not that great. But in reality, you are going to have to use it. Next is Elemental Hero Aqua Neos. This one's a little. What's a fair grading for this? Like I said, this... Alright, so before I even do that, this card basically, all it requires is Neos, Elemental Hero Neos, and Aqua Dolphin. And all it does is you can discard a card to destroy a random card in your opponent's hand. That is all it does. Here's the problem with this card. In theory, that's a good effect. But in practice, this is a going second deck, so who really cares about what's in your opponent's hand? You don't really need to destroy your opponent's hand. You're dealing with your opponent's field. You're not dealing with your opponent's hand. So this card actually, with all of that considered, is actually not that good. I'd say it's like right here. It's just, with all of that considered, it's just not very, very good. Just because, like I said, it's not, you're not going to be using that effect very often. But it is, you can summon it off of Neos Fusion. And I guess if you wanted to make like a turn one play, you could just, because this deck does struggle going first, if you want to make a going first play, this would definitely be one of the cards that you use to sort of help your opponent lose advantage. But then again, you have to discard a card to use it too, and it does like always shuffle itself back into the extra deck. Alright, next is Crystallis Veil. And this card is terrible too. All these Crystallis cards suck. This card lets you tribute a Crystallis monster, and then for the rest of the turn you take no effect damage, which is so random, so random. So basically, and then on top of that, it lets you summon a Crystallis monster from your, no, it lets you summon a Neo-Spacian monster that's listed on that Crystallis monster from your deck, or, and get ready for this, either player's graveyard. So if you ever play a mirror match where you are playing, where your opponent's playing Neos and you're playing a bunch of Crystallis monsters, you can actually, in the mirror match, use this card. But like this deck, oddly enough, has a few like weird mirror match cards that I don't even understand why you would want, like why you would ever be in those situations. I don't know if they just expected this to like take off as a meta deck. And I think that would have been interesting if this was a meta deck, because you could literally take cards out of your opponent's graveyard. So that would be, in theory, interesting. But unfortunately, again, you don't want to play the Crystallis monsters. And you want to... This card basically does, again, what the Crystallis monsters do. But instead of doing it just with the monster effect, you are doing it off of a trap card. So you actually activate the monster effect off of another card. It's just bad. Like unless you're playing against like Trickstars, why would you even want to stop effect damage? I mean, unless you're playing like an FTK or something. But again, like, why, if you were playing against an FTK, why would you run all of this garbage? Yeah, it's just a mess. This card is really not great. But it is cool that it summons out of your opponent's graveyard. Brave Neos, this is actually a really good card. I'd say top of B tier. Pushing A. This card's really good. Basically what it does is, the fusion requirements are 2 monsters, Neos and Elemental Hero Neos, and any level 4 or lower effect monster, which is pretty simple in terms of requirements. Like, just it's all the Neo-Spacian monsters. It's actually any of the hero monsters if you were like blend the decks in some way. In addition to that, it's all of the Crystallis monsters if you really wanted to do that, which I suggest you don't. But basically what this does is it allows you it gains 100 attack for every hero and Neo-Spacian in the graveyard, which is not going to be that much because you're typically shuffling them back into the deck, or you're banishing them. You're always doing something with your cards in your graveyard, so it's not going to be much. But it does, it'll have some sort of attack gain. But its second effect is a lot better, which is if it attacks and destroys an opponent's monster by battle, you can search a Neos card, which can help you because you can go main phase 1, activate this, do this Hall effect, search, and then main phase 2 you can go into you can search Neos Fusion, and then you can go into Nebula, for example, and then you can draw cards and shuffle, and then banish your opponents, and then banish the entire field face down, and then obviously you're going to be up in card advantage, and you can just OTK the following turn. So it's a pretty cool, pretty decent card in that regard. Alright, next is Contact Out. This card is right here. It helps you dodge certain cool effects, but I mean, for the most part, you're not going to use this card. Basically, what it lets you do is target a Neos Fusion monster on the field, return to the extra deck, and then if the monsters that you use to summon it are in the deck, you can special summon them to the field. So in certain situations, that can actually be helpful. Like if your opponent tries to negate one of your hero monsters, if you're one of your fusions, you can return it to the deck. Or if they try to target it for destruction, you can just put it back in the deck, summon the targets back out. So it can help you dodge around weird things. Also, it can help you dodge around the end phase effect, which again is not the worst thing ever. Also, it's a quick play, so you can use it during the battle phase. It's got some. Actually, I'll put this at the bottom of C tier. It's not the worst card ever. I can imagine maybe using it, maybe searching it off of Brave Neos or something like that. But for the most part, it really doesn't advance you in any way. It just it's kind of like a card that you have in addition to your existing cards that are just kind of neutral. So for that reason, this card's not too great. Next is Neos Alias, F tier. This card used to be somewhat usable because it was actually a 1900 attack monster that basically mimics Neos. And as a lot of you guys know this, it's a Gemini monster, and I hate Gemini monsters. I think they should have never come out. I think they're just stupid monsters that are basically you have to wait a whole turn, and well, not wait a whole turn, but you basically have to normal summon them in addition to your existing normal summon. So if you special summon them, you have to waste your normal summon on them, and if you normal summon them, you have to wait a turn to normal summon them again. So I don't like Gemini monsters as a concept, and to be honest with you, Neo-Space Connector is out. You actually do not need to play this card in any way. It's absolutely terrible. There's no reason to do it. You don't need, like I said, there's absolutely no reason to play this card. It's not good. Next is Neos. I don't want to get the name wrong exactly, but it's Neos Knight. This card is another one that just doesn't really meld well with the deck. It's basically a Neos monster with a warrior monster. I'd say it's here. It can come up sometimes. It has two attacks a turn, and any damage your opponent would take from this is nullified. They take nothing. It just kind of doesn't gel with the rest of the deck. This is actually not a contact fusion. This is a standard fusion. So you do use polymerization or a fusion spell for it. So for those reasons, I'm not too big on it because it's literally different from every other card in the archetype. And typically there are just far better options to actually go into than this card. Next is Cross Porter. This card suffers from really old card text. In theory, it's kind of okay, but it suffers from really old card text. Basically, what it does is let you send a monster from your side of the field to the graveyard, and then you can special summon a Neo-Spacian from your hand. That effect is just kind of decent, but again, let's say you had this card in your hand, an Aqua Dolphin. You normal summon this, you send it to the graveyard, and then you can summon Aqua Dolphin from your hand, or you can just normal summon Aqua Dolphin. So yeah, for that reason, this card is kind of iffy already. It's also not Neo-Spacian in name, so it's completely out of the loop, so it's not searchable. On top of that, this card, when this card is sent to the graveyard, you can add a Neo-Spacian monster, which sounds really good, except it misses timing. So unless you can specifically Foolish Burial this to the graveyard, or you activate effect, you activate something that doesn't get in between that chain, then this card is half decent. But this card in a lot of cases will actually have you miss timing anyway, so it actually is not very good for that reason. Next is Double Hero Attack. This card's pretty cool, but the problem with this card is that you already have to be in like a winning position in order to actually successfully use this card. So for that reason, I don't like it. This is definitely like I'd say it's here. Like, you already have to be winning the game in order to use this card. Because if you have a Neos, and it requires a lot of setup too. That's the other issue with this card. Basically, if you have a fusion that has Elemental Hero Neos in its text, you can special summon a hero monster, fusion hero monster from your graveyard, ignoring its summoning conditions, which is again, in a vacuum, a cool effect, because there's really no cost other than just having all of that setup already there. And you can make, and like I said, it ignores summoning conditions, so for that reason it's good. Like, it can summon a lot of different cards, but the question is, how do you get them there? That's the issue. Yeah, that's kind of like the main problem with that card, is that it's very difficult to get those monsters there in the first place, unless your opponent like destroys them, and then you do this as like a follow-up play on a turn 5 or something like that. But like, in theory, that card's actually half decent. Alright, next is Next. This card is actually really good. Top of A tier. Really, really good card. I like this card a lot. Basically, it's a trap card, and if your opponent doesn't... If you control no cards, you can activate it from your hand. Its effects are pretty good. You can summon any number of Neo-Spacian monsters or Elemental Hero Neos from your graveyard or from your hand to the field, and their effects are negated. And as long as those monsters are on the field, you cannot special summon from the extra deck, except for fusion monsters, which again is fine, because you will almost exclusively go into fusion monsters anyway. Like I said, the only one you go into is Verde Anaconda, and so this card is actually like pretty good, especially since you can activate it from your hand. Like, your opponent, like I said, this is a going second deck, so your opponent goes, they set up their board, and then the first thing you do is activate this card, and your opponent has to instantly respond and choose whether they have to negate this or let this go through. And it can actually summon 2 to 3 monsters fairly easily. So I like this card a lot. It's a very, very good card. It's one of the cards that actually helps you in a reasonable manner spam your board, unlike the Crystallis cards, which help you spam your board in an unreasonable manner, and even worse, the Cocoon cards, which help you spam your board in a really unreasonable manner. But this card is actually pretty good. Spams the board very, very easily. Like I said, whether it's better than Nebula is still up for debate. These are good because they actually help you like set up and play the deck. Like, the boss monsters are fine. It's nice to have boss monsters, but the issue is if you can't get into them, none of that matters. And this is one of the ways that you can actually go into Nebula Neos rather easily. Alright, next is Elemental Hero Magma Neos. This card's effects are pretty cool. This is a top of C tier type of card, just because it really depends on whether or not you're playing Flare Scarab. Like, you're always going to be playing Grand Neos. It's whether we're not Grand Neos. You're always going to be playing Grand Mole. It's whether or not you're playing the Flare Scarab. So this card basically gains 400 attack for every. It requires Flare Scarab, Grand Mole, and of course Neos. This card basically what it does is it gains 400 for every card on the field, which can be a lot, honestly, depending on the situation. But its other effect is when it's shuffled into the deck during the end phase, you can return all cards on the field back to their hand. So that effect is actually pretty cool, and that's why it is at the top of C tier. Like I said, if the Flare Scarab was more of a staple in the deck, like a guaranteed staple, I'd say this would be a little bit higher. But I think its effects are pretty good. A little tough to summon because you have to summon like all of that, and it's not really worth it. Most of the time, you're going to want to summon Nebula Neos. Nebula Neos is usually trumps all of the other 3 monster. It usually trumps all of the other 3 monster Neos cards. Typically, the Nebula Neos is better than most of them. But like I said, it's a half decent card. Grand Mole. This is a tough one. Another one. Okay, I'll put this in A tier. Not only are you actually playing this card, like, you actually have to play this card for all of the fusion requirements, This card is so good because it to this day it was so good for so many years. It was limited to one for such a long time, like seriously a very long time in the game of Yu-Gi-Oh. A lot of people said even up to the day that it was unlimited, that this card couldn't come back. It was toxic. It was not right for the game. This card is really good. Like, it's very good monster removal. Non-targeting, non-destruction, monster removal. You can attack basically any monster, and both of them get bounced back to the hand. It outs Dragoon, it outs Borreload, Boral Sword. Like, this card just outs so many, like, boss monsters that you could just think of in the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! Just because it doesn't destroy, it doesn't target, and it bounces back to the hand. Very good form of removal. In a going second deck, this is easily the best of the Neo-Spacian monsters to play because it like I said, it just doesn't, it gets rid of your opponent's monster without any of the grief. And it's basically off of just a normal summon. And it's very easy to summon in this deck with all of the other cards that you're playing. So, not bad. Next is Cocoon Party. This is the only card that I would probably put above all of the Cocoon monsters. Basically, for every Crystallis monster in your graveyard, you can special summon a Neo-Spacian monster, so that's not a bad effect at all. It just requires a lot of setup. It's not like these that are just straight up -1s that are counterproductive to the actual effect of the cards. This one's actually not bad. I'm sorry, for every Neo-Spacian, it summons the Crystallis monster. I mixed those two things up. Yeah, but that's basically what it does. It's not like, in theory, it's actually decent because it can help you like swarm the board. But again, here's the problem: when you actually play all of these like Crystallis and Neo-Space and all of these monsters in your deck, it actually fills up so much extra deck space that it's unbearable and completely unreasonable. And that's just think about it. You have to play like 3 of this, 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 3 of these, and then you have to play 3 of every one of the Neo-Spacians. And by that point, you're just playing like a 40, not even, like, if you played all of these cards, you'd be playing like a 60 card deck, and most of it would just be completely incoherent. You can try the Crystallis monsters in your deck, and they're just not very good at all. Yeah, just generally speaking, not very good at all. Alright, next is Elemental Hero Flare Scarab. This is one of the not so good ones. Again, it depends on if you're playing Flare Scarab, if you're even going to be playing this in your extra deck. This effect is really like just nothing impressive. This one is kind of annoying because it nukes your board, but this one, I'd say it's somewhere in D tier. Basically, all this does is gain 400 attack for every spawn trap card, which is just not really that impressive. And then during the end phase, it shuffles itself back into the deck. Just really underwhelming, really lackluster. Honestly, most of the time, not worth summoning. Like, even if your opponent's playing 5 back row, that's 2,000 attack more than it has. Like, it's just not as good as a lot of the other cards. Aaron, you're more likely to have a life point difference, so Neos is better in most cases than this. Plus, a lot of even back row decks typically don't even set 5 anymore. A lot of decks are playing hand traps. They might have 2 or 3 cards set. They might, and if they're not playing a back row deck, they'll typically have 1 card, maybe like 1 face-up spoiled trap card, but for the most part, you're not going to have a whole lot. And on top of that, this card has no protection whatsoever, so you could just normal summon. They can activate Compulsory Evacuation Device, and just you lose your monster. So definitely not not a very good effect. Next is Convert Contact. This card is actually pretty good. As a draw spell, I actually like it a lot. Yeah, I'll put it in A tier. I still play 3 of this card. Some people have cut it, but I actually like this card a lot. You can actually replace this for... If you're going to replace this card for any card, it'd be Pot of Extravagance, but you wouldn't even need to replace it because you can actually use both of them. I actually think this card does a lot of good setup for the deck, because basically what this card does is it lets you send 2 Neo-Spacians to the graveyard, 1 from your hand and then 1 from the deck. And if you've been listening, that sets up for like Miracle Contact, that sets up for Contact Gate, it sets up for a few other very good cards in your deck, because it automatically puts 2 Neo-Spacians into the graveyard. 1, like I said, 1 from your hand and 1 from the deck. And then after that, it lets you draw 2 cards. So it's like a Foolish Burial, and it lets you draw 2 cards. So for a lot of reasons, that is a very good effect. Like I said, the only issue with this card is most of the more competitive Elemental Hero Neos decks that are played, play a very small amount of Neo-Spacians in the main deck. Like, they play a very, very small amount of the targets, so that can actually be a little bit problematic, because you might not see any Neo-Spacians in your opening hand, and this might end up being a dead card. But if you're playing like a larger amount of Neo-Spacian monsters, this card can actually be a very, very good card in the deck, and it's one of the better draw cards, I gotta say. Next is Elemental Hero Glow Moss. This card's like really weird, and I'd say this is anything to do with Glow Moss I'm not a huge fan of. I'd actually put it here. Anything to do with Glow Moss just introduces a level of randomness to a deck that really doesn't need it in any way. It just doesn't need it. Like, I don't know why. So Elemental Hero Glow Moss, basically you destroy a monster your opponent controls, and then based on destroy a card your opponent controls, and then based on what you destroy, monster, spell, trap, you get different effects. If it's a monster, this card can't attack. If it's a spell, you can attack directly, which that effect is actually pretty cool, except there aren't a lot of face-up spells on the field, and your opponent isn't exactly going to be setting spell cards, because that's typically pretty dumb. And if they do set spell cards, it's going to be a quick play spell, so they can just chain to this card, and then, you know, it's gone. So for that reason, the spell destruction is pretty dumb. And then if it's a trap card, you change this to defense position, and then you definitely can't attack with this card. So basically, effect number 1 and effect number 3, destroying a monster, destroying a trap, basically prevents you from attacking with this monster in a deck that wants to go second. And then during the end phase, the monster's shuffled back anyway, so if it's changed to defense mode, like that, you missing that attack is actually missing quite a bit. So yeah, this one is actually pretty bad. It's not as bad as a lot of the other cards, but like I said, it really depends on if you want to play Glow Moss at all. I'm not a huge fan of Glow Moss. Like I said, introduces way too much stupidity and randomness and unnecessity to the deck. Glow Moss is just a mess of a card all around. Definitely something I would steer clear of if you can. Next is Generation. I don't remember the exact name of this card. Generation 4. This card's pretty. It's a cool tech. Say this is B tier. Yeah, I think it is Generation next. Basically, what it does is you activate it, and based on the difference in life points between you and your opponent, you can add a Neo-Spacian monster or a hero monster from your deck to your hand, which typically, I don't know if what the situation is, how different your life points are going to be, unless you're like paying a ton of life points to do a lot of different card effects. But yeah, basically it lets you summon a monster whose attack is equal to or less than the difference, which is pretty cool. But in addition to that effect, you cannot activate the effects of that monster. You can either special summon it, or you can add it to your hand. Typically, it's better to just special summon it, and then you can use it to contact into one of your larger fusion monsters. So yeah, it's basically like another way to get a free summon. All you have to have is just a life point difference. That's the only issue with it. Next is Neo-Space Connector. I'm very excited about this. Like I said, alright, so this is going to be an S tier. I don't know where in S tier we're going to discuss it. But as you can see here, there are a lot of bad cards in this archetype. Like, a lot. Like, stupid amounts of bad cards in this archetype. And it's very, very thrilling to actually be able to talk about a good one, because this is definitely a good one. I don't know where to place this. I don't know if I'm going to place this here or here. I think any of these places is fair. I'm going to place it in S tier, just because it does so much positive stuff from the deck that the deck is just missing. All three of these cards all basically cheat around the fact that from the core, this is a really bad archetype. Like, if you don't play these three cards, if you don't play these three cards and maybe like Generation next, these three cards, and then next, if you don't play those 4 cards, this deck is almost unplayable. Like, literally, it's almost like totally unplayable. And this is one of the cards that really has helped the deck, because on normal summon, it gets to special summon a Neo-Spacian monster from your deck. That effect is very, very good. You could summon Aqua Dolphin, and you could pop a card out of your opponent's hand. You could summon Grand Mole, and you could attack and then return things. Like, it's good for utility. It's actually really good for warrior decks, because even warrior decks play this, because it lets you summon 2 warriors extremely easily. from your deck. So that effect is already very good because it's actually a struggle to get monsters from your deck onto the board, like Neo-Spacian monsters. That effect is already incredibly good. It has a second effect where it can tribute itself in order to special summon a Neo-Spacian or a Neos from the graveyard. So that effect is also very, very good. Also, I forgot to mention, on normal summon, this card can summon a Elemental Hero Neos or a Neo-Spacian from your deck. So it can actually basically fill everything that you don't have, so that you have a live Contact Gate or you have a live, what is it called, Contact Fusion. This card is extremely, extremely, extremely good for the deck. It adds a lot of, what is it called, consistency to the deck, and it actually makes it a playable strategy rather than one big fat mess. Next is Elemental Hero Rainbow Neos. This is definitely an S tier card. I'd put it like right above Contact Gate. Typically, the best cards and the best fusions to go into are these two, Nebula Neos and this thing, the Rainbow Neos. So Rainbow Neos used to actually be an F tier card. It used to be completely terrible, out of this world bad to summon, because you would have to summon a elemental here. You'd have to summon a Rainbow Dragon, which is very difficult to summon, because you'd have to play a Crystal Beast deck, and then you would have to summon an Elemental Hero Neos, and then you can Contact Fuse those two into this monster. And because the summoning requirements for this monster were always so difficult, they put a crazy effect on this card. And the effect on this card is that you can send a monster on your side of the field, or a spell or trap card on your side of the field to the graveyard, or a card from the top of your deck to the graveyard to do a variety of different effects. If you send a monster to the field, from the field to the graveyard, you can shuffle all monsters your opponent controls back to the deck. Insane non-targeting removal. If you send a spell or trap card you control to the graveyard, you can shuffle away all spell and trap cards your opponent controls. Again, non-targeting, non-destruction. They'll probably never see them again. Really, really good effect. That second effect is incredibly, incredibly good with Red Reboot. If you Red Reboot your opponent, you activate that, you shuffle away their back row. No back row deck can come back from that. Literally no back row deck. And then the last one, you can send the top card of your deck to the graveyard, shuffle their graveyard back into their deck, which that card is really, really good for decks that rely on graveyard setup, because you just you shuffled everything back and their graveyard setup is gone. So all three effects are really, really good, and this card is extremely easy to summon off of Neos Fusion, because it is a 2-monster Neos. It's a 2-monster Elemental Hero Neos Fusion monster, and Neos Fusion thankfully ignores summoning conditions. On top of that, you can actually use Predaplant Verde Anaconda, send the Neos Fusion to the graveyard, and then summon the Elemental Hero Rainbow Neos. This card actually has you actually have access to this card in virtually every single deck, and for that reason, absolutely amazing, absolutely disgusting. You can even use it with the Dark Rainbow Neos if you wanted to, and if you're playing like a dark deck, that card wouldn't even be like a total brick, because you can actually legitimately summon it if you draw it, if you're playing a dark deck. Elemental Hero Prisma. This one is actually pretty good. This is an Elemental Hero, but it actually does work in this deck, because you can normal summon or reveal any monster, in any extra deck monster in your in your extra deck, and then it becomes one of the materials listed on that monster, so it can help fill the holes of not having drawn something. And you can also use like a Hero Lives, summon this out. You can use a Hero Lives, pay half your life points, summon this thing out, and then basically you've halved your life points, so it's made cards like Generation Next Live, it's made cards like Air Neos better, it's made a lot of different cards better. You have your life points, summon this thing, and then you can turn this into like a Grand Mole, or an Aqua Dolphin, or a Moss, or any of these other cards, or just a regular Elemental Hero Neos if you really wanted to. But basically, yeah, this card is very good for the deck. It's actually kind of reliant on whether or not it's actually reliant on a Hero Lives and whether it's at 1 or 3 on the ban list, because they like to move that card around. But when this card's at 3 on the ban list, it's definitely an A tier and above, possibly. But as of right now, I'd say a fair placement for this card would be, actually right here is probably bottom of A tier would be a fair placement for this card. It's not like an outrageously good card, but it is a very, very, very good card in the deck. Flare Scarab. This is another one. I'm going to put it near like, Actually, I think I made a mistake. I'm going to put Glow Moss right here. And I'm going to put this right here. This basically just gains attack for back row. Not really that great. Elemental Hero Neos, namesake of the deck. You have to play it. It's necessary for all of your fusion plays. You literally cannot avoid playing it. And my rule typically is if a card is A tier and above, you cannot avoid playing it. So just by that, I should put this here. Yeah, basically, if a card is A tier or above, you have to play it. And I think I'm pretty consistent with that rule. So definitely you have to play the Neos in your deck. You cannot get around that. You need it. You just absolutely need it. And it's actually a pretty cool card to summon off the Neo-Space connector. Yeah, that card's very good. Next is Elemental Hero Cosmo Neos. This card is really good, but it's just very, very, like, it takes a lot to summon it. This is definitely, like, I'd say bottom of A tier. I think I made a mistake with Brave Neos. I think he's actually up here. He's what your other good option off of the Neos Fusion. But basically, yeah, this card's actually pretty good. Basically, what it does is when it requires a Elemental Hero Neos and then 3, and you hear this, 3 copies, 3 Neo-Spacians. So for that reason, this card is a little tough to summon. Typically, you will summon it off of Miracle Contact, which is this card here, by shuffling cards away out of your graveyard. You don't typically want to use monsters on the field to do it unless you summon them like off of next on like turn 5 or something. Typically, you do not want to burn like your field resources to summon this monster. But it is actually a fairly good card because when you summon it, it has 3,500 attack. Like I said, it requires 4 materials. It is a contact fusion, so it's not that big of a... It's either a contact fusion or a miracle, so you don't have to use polymerization or all that other nonsense, like just all the others. But most importantly, when this card hits the field, your opponent can't activate effects, like any effects, for the rest of the turn, and also it can't respond. Your opponent can't respond to the activation of that effect. So basically, this hits the field, stops your opponent from activating any more effects, and your opponent can't chain anything to that effect being activated. So as soon as it hits the field, your opponent can't. Basically, you have a turn where your opponent can't do anything. It's like what is it called? It's like Dark Ruler No More for absolutely everything. So that effect is really, really good. On top of that, when this card is shuffled back into the extra deck, just like all of the Neos monsters, or the other Neos fusion monsters, it nukes the board. It destroys all our other cards on the field. Now that second, like kind of like nuking effect is actually not as good as some of the others. I think Storm Neos is better. Magma Neos is a better like end phase nuking effect, and I think definitely Cosmo this Cosmo Neos, Nebula Neos definitely has a better like nuking end phase effect. But that effect can stop your opponent from activating anything else is actually really, really broken, because you can summon that, stop your opponent from activating anything, and then summon Air Neos, and if your life points difference is pretty significant, you just attack and end the game just right there. But definitely a very interesting card. Like I said, I mostly go into the Rainbow Neos and the Nebula Neos, but I do occasionally go into the Sky if I have enough resources available to me. Alright, next is Elemental Hero Neos Kluger. This card is pretty interesting. So Neos Kluger, it basically requires a Yubel, and it requires a copy of Elemental Hero Neos. Now, back in the day, this would be very difficult to summon, but like I said, fortunately we have Neos Fusion, so this is a available target that you can summon in the future. This isn't a card that's out, but I'm like, you know what, I'll just do it because I don't want people to, when this card does come out, to be messaging me about, hey, redo this tier list because it's way too much work. The issue with this card is I haven't even told you the effects yet, and I'm already giving you the issues. So basically what this card does is it battles with a monster. It can inflict effect damage to your opponent equal to the attack of that monster. So that effect is pretty good. Also, when this card is destroyed, you can special summon a Neos Wise Man from your deck. Which, again, it requires you to play a number of bricks, which I don't like. Because you basically have to play the Yubel as a brick in your deck, and then you have to play this as a brick in your deck, and this is only if this card leaves the field because of your opponent's card effect. And again, you're getting a Neos Wise Man, which honestly is not that great of a card. So you really have to ask yourself, do you really want to play all of those additional bricks in your deck? And in most cases, the answer is probably going to be no. but I'd say it's a half decent card because it gives you the ability to float. It gives you the ability to end games by inflicting a ton of attack damage to your opponent, or effect damage. If you attack a large monster, you can inflict quite a bit of damage to your opponent, which is pretty cool. But to be honest with you, in most cases, you will actually just want to go into the Rainbow Neos with your Neo-Spacian. You will not want to go into the Kluger. You'd rather go into this. And again, this card's not even released anyway, but you can, if you wanted to, play it online with whatever online platform that you use. But that is basically it. I hope that you guys have enjoyed this video. I know I've enjoyed making it, and I'm going to try to get around to the other hero archetypes, and this just dug a giant chunk out of that. Me having to include these cards into that giant list that I'm going to be doing at some point. But thank you for watching, and subscribe. Alright guys, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoy this type of content, check out the other videos on the channel, and please subscribe. It helps the channel a lot. Again, thank you so much. Have a terrific day.